All right. Welcome to night 2 of the African American prophetic tradition, the rhetoric and the theology of James Cone. So glad to be here with you. I am Dr. Andre Johnson, Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Media Studies at the University of Memphis, but also the visiting scholar here at Memphis Theological Seminary. And we are just so thankful and grateful that the seminary has given us an opportunity to not only facilitate and teach this class, but to offer the James Cone class just one more time. So we are thankful and grateful for that. On last night, I gave the guest lecture to get things kicked off. If you are interested in watching that, you can go to the Gifts of Life Ministries or the G Life Urban Oasis YouTube page, or you can just, if you follow me on Facebook or on Twitter, you can catch it there. But tonight we have Dr. Latrice Donaldson. She's going to come and give us our guest lecture tonight, and I'm going to introduce her in a few minutes. But let me take care of some housekeeping items. First and foremost, if you are interested in this or any other classes at Memphis Theological Seminary, just go to the website, memphisseminary.edu. memphisseminary.edu. You can get all of the information there. You can talk to my good friend, the Dean, Dr. Peter Gackey, and all of the wonderful faculty at Memphis Theological Seminary. A lot of people know that my first teaching gig right after I defended my dissertation and walked across the stage, I just kept on walking over to Memphis Theological Seminary. And I am just so ever grateful, not only being a graduate of the seminary, but also being a faculty member there, a tenure faculty member at Memphis Theological Seminary, and the work that I'm doing right now as a visiting scholar, offering this class, and we are going to seriously offer some more classes as well too. So we are, again, so excited about our guest lecturer tonight. Latrice Donaldson is the Assistant Professor of History at Texas A&M University at Corpus Christi. Dr. Donaldson specializes in the late 19th and early 20th century African-American military history, the Gilded Age, World War I, and gender history. She works at the intersection of race, gender, military service, and the long civil rights movement. Now, she is the author of Duty Beyond the Battlefield, African-American Soldiers Fight for Racial Uplift, Citizenship, and Manhood, 1870 to 1920, and A Voyage Through the African-American Experience. She is also an editor for a new book series. So all of you looking for an opportunity to publish, you might want to check out this book series, The Black Soldier in War and Society, New Narratives and Critical Perspectives with the University of Virginia Press. Her current book project is titled Race Prophets, A History of the Army's Black Chaplains. And we are just so grateful and so thankful to have with us Dr. Latrice Donaldson. Dr. Donaldson, thank you for being here on today, and thank you for making time for this class today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. This is a true treat. Anytime I get to talk about Black liberation theology and participate in any kind of conversation relating to James Cone, I'm excited to do it. So thank you for the invitation and for this opportunity. So I just want to jump right in and get started with what we're going to cover today, which is looking at Black liberation theology before Cone, essentially, looking at its origin story. But before I do that, I want to begin with a African-American folktale that came about from the 1700s. And it fits, don't worry, it'll fit with what we're doing today. All right. So this title of the folktale is called The Jackal and the Dog. All right. So one day, the jackal and the dog were walking together side by side when the dog looked over to the jackal and said, "How sad for you." And the jackal looked back at the dog, "Why so sad?" And the dog said, "I don't have to hunt for food. I have my food given to me in the village. I would not like to have to hunt for my food. Man gives me my food." And the jackal looked back at the dog. "You have food given to you by man? You don't have to hunt?" And the dog said, "Yes, man gives me my food. If you do not believe me, come to the village tonight." And with that, they parted. The dog went to the village, but the jackal, he had to go to the forest. You see, that's where he had to get his food. He would have to hunt for hours to get something to eat. And if he did not catch anything, he would have to eat berries and vines and roots. Well, as darkness fell, he went to the village where he could use the darkness to cloak himself. And there in the village, he saw the dog running around yelping, "Yelp, yelp." And the more the dog yelped, the more man would throw him a bone or throw him a piece of meat. Well, the dog kept on yelping and running around till at one moment the dog kicked over one of the milk buckets. For you see, that's what they would drink. And when the milk bucket was kicked over, one of the men of the village kicked the dog. And when he kicked the dog rolled out of the village onto the feet of the jackal. When the jackal looked down at the dog, the jackal said, "I may have to hunt for my food, but nobody kicks me." And with that, the jackal left, leaving the dog on the ground where he was. So, who would you rather be, the jackal or the dog? The conversation that we're going to have tonight revolves around the origins of Black liberation theology, rooted in the fight from the very beginning in the origins of the Black church and the beginnings of the Black church, and fighting for the ultimate liberation of all African Americans. So let me share my screen and we will begin. Okay, hold on, where's the mouse? It's gonna come over here, there it is. Okay, so when looking at the beginnings of Black liberation theology in this country, it is directly tied to the identity of African Americans. At the end of the Revolutionary War, African Americans were put in a precarious position of, should they stay in the US? What will their position be depending on where they lived, whether they lived in the North or the South? And at the beginning of at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, you have the beginnings and the creation of a Black religious rhetorical tradition and what that's going to look like. And so there are a couple of questions we're going to cover throughout this lecture this evening. And one will be, of course, why there had to be a difference, right? What is the difference between the Black religious rhetoric versus white religious rhetoric? And it comes down to subservience versus resistance, right? How do we come up with an African-American theology? And so we're going to look at several figures tonight that help to create what will eventually be called Black liberation theology by James Cone. But in looking at these individuals, you'll see based off their language, based off of their ideology, based off the theology they're advocating, that this is directly tied to liberation theology. The independent African-American church is founded on the idea of liberation theology. And so it's important to really grasp that in understanding the origins of African-American identity, you have to understand how it's related to liberation theology. And so we will look at, why it's necessary, of course, and of course, who are its prophets. And so there are several figures that we'll look at David Walker, Mariah Stewart, Joanna Lee, Nat Turner, Henry McNeil, Henry Highland Garnett. These are individuals who are going to what would be considered the early prophets of this new independent religion. So, in going forward, one of the things that's important to understand when looking at the birth of the independent Black church and the origins of Black liberation theology is that it is rooted in resistance. The fact is, African Americans, when looking at their brothers and sisters in bondage, are going to consistently challenge the idea of white paternalism. And what that means is the rhetoric of white Christian theology at the time was that I'm sure you're familiar with the scriptures that they use to say that African Americans, that their position because of the color of their skin is that to be slaves, is that to be because they are the cursed descendants of Ham. And it is because of that labeling that they are required to be enslaved and under the control of whites. And so the independent Black church is going to, from its beginning, reject this idea of white Christian theology that's being propagated. The idea, because one, the fact that they want to separate themselves from the white Christian church, the fact that they are going to fight and consistently maintain this separate space that is sacred and away from the gaze of whites, is going to help to secure and create a tradition of fighting for liberation, right? It's going to be the Black independent churches that are going to serve as safe havens for runaway slaves, for the poor and the widowed and the orphan children. It's going to be the independent Black church that's going to help to sustain African traditions, as well as holding up the mirror into white America and white Christians, and thinking about the fact that, in the words of Frederick Douglass here, too much religion, too little humanity, right? In rejecting the ideology that African Americans were born to be subservient. They were born to be enslaved because they are cursed by God, and rejecting that and coming up with and saying, no, in fact, we are the chosen ones of God. We are the true adherers to the ideology and theology of God. And so when coming up with this is dangerous for African Americans, right? They creating these spaces and being able to maintain these kind of spaces is going to become dangerous, and they're going to be constantly monitored. So when Cone is advocating for and challenging, when we get to Black Power movement and James Cone's book and his coming up with the label, if you think about the history of African Americans and the creation of the independent Black church, it has always been rooted in liberation theology. It just never had that name before. And so, when I teach my Africana studies courses, I always include Black liberation theology as a key component because, most students have never even heard of that phrase before. And it's baffling to me because if you have to study the history of African Americans, you have to study the history of the Black church. Because I'm going to keep saying the term, the independent Black church, because the creation of this independent institution allows for the sustainability of separate independent Black institutions, fraternal organizations, auxiliary organizations, benevolent societies, educational opportunities, as well as safe havens to escape the horrible institution that was chattel slavery. So how do we create the independent Black church? Well, one of the first things one of the first institutions that was created to allow for the independent Black church to thrive was the Free African Society, which was founded in April 12th, 1787. And all of its founders were Black men. The two most prominent that we will look at this evening is going to be Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Right. So the Free African Society, founded in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was the first Black mutual aid society in the United States. It was structured and set up like a church and was designed to serve the entire Black community. So when people were trying to run away, when people were running away, before you could escape on the Underground Railroad, the Free African Society provided aid to those seeking shelter to escape the institution of slavery. And eventually, they're going to change their name to the Colored Church in Union, Colored Union in Church. But up until the 1820s, it's going to be called the Free African Society. And the importance of being called the Free African Society is tied directly to the idea that they are tying themselves to the identity and the homeland of Africa. Because I mean, the fact is they could have chosen the Negro Aid Society, they could have chosen the Colored Aid Society, which they eventually do change their name to, but when they start, they're going to be called the Free African Society. And this ties directly into them embracing their heritage of being of African descent, right? And so when we look at the rhetoric of white Christian theology at the time, where everything they say about people of African descent, enslaved Africans, is tied to something negative, is tied to being cursed and designed to be the property and not even human. And so the fact that the first Black mutual aid society in the United States is going to be called the Free African Society sends a very clear message as to their decision to want to identify with their Blackness, to want to identify with the continent of Africa. And looking at liberation theology and looking at the idea of racial uplift, right? Their goal is to uplift all Black people, to try to liberate all Black people. And they're going to help, for example, when people are running away, to help provide new identities, to help teach them about what it means to be free, as well as trying to teach respectability politics. So when we look at the Free African Society, it's because of the Free African Society that we're able to get the first two Black independent churches in the United States, which will be the Episcopalian Church, which will be headed by Absalom Jones, and then the second one, which is the more famous one, which will be Mother Bethel Church or Bethel Church in Philadelphia, which is the first independent Black church of the AME faith. And so that was founded in the same year, but founded a few days later. But the Free African Society was created and allowed for the creation of these independent Black institutions. And it's rooted in attempting to liberate and providing opportunities to liberate those who are enslaved and fighting to liberate those who are enslaved in the South. And so the independent Black church was created as a rejection of the idea that Blacks were supposed to be enslaved. And so keeping that in mind, that is one of the reasons why when I titled this Black Liberation Theology Before Cone, because of the fact that everything around the creation of the independent Black church is rooted in fighting for the independence and the liberation of other of their enslaved brothers and sisters. All right. So we're about to go into the who I like to call, or people call them, the Black founding fathers. And we're going to look at the two most prominent African-American founders, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. Some other African-American founders would be Benjamin Banneker and Crispus Attucks, right? The first person to be killed in the Boston Massacre. Anyway, but we're going to look at Richard Allen, Absalom Jones as the two first African-American founders. So in looking at the life of Richard Allen, he was born into slavery and bought his freedom, liberated himself. And he, from an early age upon his liberation, he was always drawn to the idea of racial uplift, right? The idea of creating and fighting for the complete and total upliftment of the Black community. And slavery was a blight, and the continued oppression relating to slavery was something that Allen fought against his entire life. He married Sarah Allen, who also, before she married him, was an abolitionist, right? But continued, and they both joined together in raising money and creating institutions that would allow for the ways to ensure African-American liberation and upliftment. So he initially attended church at St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia. Him and Absalom Jones initially began preaching, and the more they preached, the more African Americans would join that. Initially, it was a predominantly white church, but more African Americans would attend when him and Jones would preach. And so the white members of the church became concerned at the increased presence of, now, they wanted the Black members to attend, but they also didn't want them to attend in integrated services. So they would only allow Allen and Jones to preach at on these early morning segregated services. And then as they expanded as a congregation, they built a balcony where they would try to force African Americans to sit in a segregated situation. And so Jones and Allen were furious at this idea that because they are tithe-paying members of this church, why are they trying to segregate them? And so the first Sunday that they tried to attempt to institute the policy of segregation at this church in Philadelphia, Jones and Allen kneeled to pray, and then after they prayed, they first sat in the white section. And then once they came over to try to ask them to leave, they said their prayer, and then they got up and they led and walked out. And all the Black members who were sitting in the segregated section walked out with them. And this is an act of defiance, this is an early, act of Black agency in fighting for Black liberation and equality. And so they wanted to provide this space in the creating of these independent Black churches to assist runaway slaves. Philadelphia becomes a major hub in helping to facilitate African Americans who are fleeing slavery. Frederick Douglass, when he fled, he went to Philadelphia to get a new name. Harriet Tubman regularly, when she was liberating people, would stop in Philadelphia. It was a major stop and a major hub for those seeking liberation from enslavement. And so the creation of the AME Church, the creation of the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas by Absalom Jones, they're created to provide safe spaces. And one of the other things that Allen wanted to encourage was broader conversations about how do we achieve not only Black liberation, but also, like I said, racial uplift. His major goal in his life was he wanted to lead an exemplary life that would inspire others to follow in his footsteps, as well as to encourage the upliftment of the Black community. So that's where we get the first Negro Convention of 1830. Allen dies a year later after that, but his legacy was such that one of the last speeches that Frederick Douglass, who at the time was the most famous African American of the 19th century, One of the last public speeches that he ever gave was a sermon done by Richard Allen. And so thinking about the importance of Allen's legacy as a early Black founder, as well as an early founder in creating the independent Black church, understanding that it was always rooted in the liberation of the Black community. All right, going forward, the next person we're going to look at real quick is Absalom Jones, right? Absalom Jones was also born into slavery in Delaware. He purchased his wife's freedom before he purchased his own, so that when their kids were born, they would be born free. And so in 1778, he purchased his wife freedom. He eventually adopts the last name Jones when he's officially set free in 1784, because Jones is going to be considered an authentically American name. And so one of the things, like I said, in looking at why Jones and Allen are called Black founding fathers, is that they are not only rooting themselves with their African identity, they are also going to embrace being American, right? So they are not going to be early supporters of the idea of Blacks leaving the US and immigrating to Africa. They're going to advocate in their sermons as well as in their rhetoric that they are Black Americans and they have every right, as much a right to be here as everyone else. He is going to, like I said, he is going to be one of the early and prominent founders of the Free African Society. And so the first church that the Free African Society helped to found was the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. It is actually the first Black church to be opened in the city of Philadelphia. And he's actually going to be the first ordained priest in the United States. And he becomes the first ordained priest in 1804. When looking at, this is an image of the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas in Philadelphia. When looking at Absalom Jones's life, he in fact, like I said, is an advocate of liberation. He writes to the US Congress in 1800, petitioning for the end of the slave trade and petitioning for the gradual emancipation of all African Americans that are still held in bondage, right? Jones is going to write and protest and of course support the similar methods as Allen. Him and Allen were lifelong friends. They separated with, the only thing they separated on was Jones wanted to do the Episcopal Church and Allen wanted to do a kind of a combination with the African Methodist Episcopal Church. But when looking at Jones's life, it's very similar to Allen's in that they are advocates for the liberation of African Americans. And it's rooted in the Christian ideology because they believe that the true spirit of Christ is on the side of the oppressed, and that the true spirit of Christ is rooted in the liberation of all people. And their churches, the churches that they create, reflect this, right? So when looking at, say, for example, the birth of the AME Church, it is going to have its door open to everyone. There isn't going to be discrimination within the church, right? They are going to be, from the very beginning, early advocates. It's a part of their theology for the abolishment of slavery, right? And they're going to be a part of this new movement that's going to revolutionize the during the Second Great Awakening, where you have the creation of the Baptists and these new denominations in the US. The AME Church is going to be at the forefront of this new awakening in the evangelical movement, right? And understanding that the demanding and advocating for equality is radical, okay? What they're advocating for at the turn of in the 19th century, at the end of the 18th century, is radical compared to what's being taught, right? So for example, when Bethel Church, it's going to be it is the oldest independently Black owned property, church property in the United States. When Bethel, when they first purchased the property, the white Methodists in Philadelphia attempted to seize the church, saying that because they were Methodists, that the white Methodist body had a right to claim that church rather than it being a separate independent institution. And they took the case all the way up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled in favor of the AME church and in Bethel Church, saying that no, this is they bought this land. This is not, the white Methodist Church did not give them any money, and this property belongs to these Black congregants, to these Black church owners, and the white Methodist Church has no claim to it. And so in looking at how the Black independent church is rooted in liberation, right, and rooted in the theology of liberation, they are going to push back against the common stance that's going to be preached to, and for example, the regular sermon that's preached to enslaved Blacks during up until the end of the Civil War, where they use the common phrase, "Slaves, honor your master," right? And Allen and Jones, and eventually we'll take a look at David Walker in a second. They're going to, and Nat Turner, they're going to reject this idea that is what their role is. And so the independent Black church is a radical, revolutionary institution in America because it is founded as a rejection of enslavement. It's founded as a rejection of white paternalism and white supremacy. And it is going to advocate for the equality from the very beginning of all peoples, Black or white. And so when we look at the birth of these independent Black institutions, we think about them as conservative today, say in the 21st century, but at their origins, no, they were very radical and very much going against the grain. So it's very important to really grasp, where Cone and the liberation theology rhetoric that he comes up with out of the Black Power movement, all of this is rooted in that long tradition of Blacks fighting for equality, going back to the very beginning from when this country was founded. All right. So one of the other important aspects in looking at the early origins of the Black church is Black women, right? So one of the first Black women to ever be ordained is Miss Joanna Lee, she was born free in Cape May, New Jersey. And she began hearing the voice of God. She said that God spoke to her and said, "Go preach the gospel, preach the gospel. I will put the words in your mouth. Please go preach." And so she petitioned initially Richard Allen to be ordained, and Allen rejected her for 6 years, right? Allen said that there's nothing that said anything about women being allowed to preach. And so Joanna Lee, of course, is going to use scripture to back up her claims to be allowed to be ordained. And she said, she uses scripture in regards to Mary being, the first to go preach that Christ has arisen. She uses the rhetoric of the fact that there's nothing that says that women can't go out and spread the word and be evangelicals for the movement. And one Sunday during one of Allen's sermons, where it looked like he was very disheartened, because understand, these people truly internalized the oppression and the enslavement of other African Americans. And the fight to free them was very difficult and very long. And one Sunday, Allen apparently was disheartened, and Joanna Lee jumps up and begins to give a whole other separate sermon, and essentially changes the whole mood. And after she does that, Allen is going to ordain her and say that she truly is touched and gifted by God. And she writes she's one of the first Black women to have a autobiography published. She writes the life and religious experience of Joanna Lee. She helps to inspire other Black women to become ministers. So you get Black women actively participating from the very beginning, right? They joined with Black men in opposing slavery. They joined in with Black men to help create these independent Black institutions. So if it wasn't for the fundraising capabilities of Richard Allen's wife, Sarah Allen, there wouldn't have been a Bethel church. She not only serves as the first church mother of the church, but she served as the organist, as well as the main fundraiser and bookkeeper for the church. These organizations, such as the auxiliary groups that are going to come out of these Black churches, are going to allow for women to be more vocal in their advocacy for Black liberation. You have a figure such as Mariah Stewart, who was the protege of David Allen, who comes out and directly challenges Black men because of the fact that not enough Black men have fought to end slavery, right? You have the young lady here featured on this slide, Miss Julianne Jane Tillman, who is a preaching woman. She was never officially ordained, but she is going to, as you can see here in 1844, she's preaching from a pulpit. And she is going to be another preacher advocating and pushing for not only allowing women to preach, but also for advocating for the opposition to slavery, right? So everything rooted and tied to the advocacy of these Black women in publicly speaking, it's tied to their Christian, to their view of Christian theology, and also they're going to be advocating for the abolishment of slavery. You know, Frederick Douglass was also an ordained minister, and he too is going to use his pulpit to advocate for the abolishment of slavery. Now, the next person who I think he has the longest reach in regards to this prophetic tradition relating to James Cone is David Walker. And it's directly related to what is known as David Walker's appeal. So I'm gonna stop talking for a second. And I'm gonna play a quick excerpt from David Walker's appeal for all of you, so you can see what I am talking about. All right, so let's share this.
He is dreadfully deceived. That because he holds, the white man thinks that because he holds us in his infernal chains of slavery, that we wish to be white. But he is dreadfully deceived. We wish to be just as our Creator made us, and no avaricious, unmerciful wretch has any business to hold us in slavery or to make slaves of us. However, any man that will not fight under our Lord in the glorious and heavenly cause of freedom ought to be kept along with his children or his family as a slave or in chains to be butchered by his cruel enemies. Now, the people of America? Have we, in consequence of oppression, nearly given up the spirit of men and adopted that of brutes? And do you answer me no? Well then, I ask you, what set of men can you point to who are so abjectly employed by their oppressors as we are by our natural enemies? And how can these enemies but say that we and our children are not of the human family, but were made by the Creator to be an inheritance to them and theirs? How can the slaveholder but say that he can bribe the best colored person in this country to sell his brethren for a trifling sum of money? How can Mr. Thomas Jefferson but write, I have advanced it as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to whites in areas of both mentality and physically. It is this difference that makes it so hard to emancipate these people. Well, I'm happy that Mr. Jefferson advanced his theories for your sake. For you will either have to contradict or confirm him by your own actions, not by what our white friends have said and done for us. This country is more ours than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and our tears. I ask your attention to these words found in our own Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So, hold on. I want to make sure this is, oops. I want to make sure this is, stop playing. But when you look at what Walker was saying there, that's just an excerpt. Oops. Sorry about that. I apologize. But once you look at the this is a small excerpt from David Walker's appeal. When that was published, it produced such an uproar that a bounty was placed on Walker's head. In fact, he died maybe 2 or 3 years after it was published, because he knew that his life was going to be cut short the moment that pamphlet was published. And when we think of the language he uses in stating, one, in the belief that this country is more blacks than it is whites, right? The aggressive language, the militancy in which he's advocating for African Americans to stand up and liberate themselves, right? And the way that he disparages blacks who acquiesce to white oppression is very much something you would see, you would be like, wait, did Malcolm X say this, or David Walker said this, right? But it is all very much tied to his desire, because it sickened him. He said that he knew that he wasn't going to live a long life, because he couldn't live a long life as long as other Blacks were enslaved, and he had to do something. And so he wrote David Walker's Appeal, and he knew the moment that it was published. He edited it 6 different times within the span of 2 years, because he knew he had to get it as perfect as he possibly could, because he knew that they were going to kill him. And sure enough, he mysteriously dies. He's found dead on his doorstep in Boston, but he couldn't return to Wilmington. His family had to flee Wilmington, North Carolina, where he was originally from. And like I said, there was a bounty on his head because of what he published, because of what he wrote. Whites feared David Walker's Appeal so much that it was illegal to possess it, in the state of North Carolina. And thinking about that, right? His entire argument in that pamphlet is rooted in Christian theology. He was a very prominent member of the AME Church, and I would call him an early prophet of Black liberation theology, because of the fact that, on par with Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, because of the fact that he was willing to and knowingly risked his life to encourage, because the appeal was to all colored people of the world, not just African Americans, to fight off the shackles of oppression, right? And some historians have said possibly that Nat Turner may have read David Walker's Appeal, but when thinking about his the language that he uses, this is very radical for the early 1830s. This is a very radical message that he's advocating for, in the fact that he disparages Blacks who he feels as being quote unquote race traitors, is another huge component of this appeal. And so when we look at the tradition of Black liberation theology in this country, it's directly tied to everything relating to the creation of the independent Black church, as well as the African American identity, right? Because of the fact that they are, one, embracing their African heritage, right? The AME Church is called the African Methodist Episcopal Church. They didn't have to call it that. They could have called it something else, and they choose to call it the African Church. They choose to call the Free African Aid Society, right? They are choosing the African Episcopal Church. They are choosing to embrace and reject the idea that being of African descent is something negative. And looking at the words of David Walker, and looking at the fact that he was willing to risk his life just to publish a pamphlet, says a lot about how much chattel slavery really damaged and was a struggle for people who were supposedly free, but not really, because they could never be okay with their freedom unless all Black people were free. All right, one more, two more slides, and then we're done, right? Okay, we're almost done. I know. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm sorry. Hold on. All right. Let's go. So, whoops. Why is it going backwards? What's happening? Okay. Almost there. Okay. So, like I said, continuing, after Walker was killed, or he died, Mariah Stewart takes up his mantle, and she actually ends up becoming the first Black woman to speak to a mixed race and gendered audience. Not just first Black woman, but first woman in the United States to ever speak to a mixed gendered and race audience. And a part of that, one of the things that she ends up doing is calling out Black men for not fighting for and standing up and doing more to advocate for the liberation of those who are enslaved. And she ends up having several of her stories published in William Lord Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator. Stewart eventually, because of the fact that many of her speeches were negatively received because of their critiques, in especially going after Black men, she decides to retire from public speaking, and lives her life as first a school teacher, then eventually becoming the head of a nurse. But when looking at her writings, Mariah Stewart she becomes the matron of the Freedmen's Hospital. Mariah Stewart is continuing what David Walker's saying in regards to looking at those Blacks who acquiesce to and participate in chattel slavery. And the reason why she goes after Black men in particular is because of the idea of pushing for a revolution, similar to what happened in Haiti, right? And so, Mariah Stewart is going to continue Walker's legacy for as long as she can. And then finally, we're going to end on Henry Highland Garnet, who was also a militant abolitionist, but he did not believe that African Americans needed to live in the US. In fact, he believed and supported the idea of Blacks leaving this country as long as slavery existed, right? And so he is, once the Civil War begins, he returns to the US because he viewed it as the perfect opportunity for Blacks to liberate themselves and through armed conflict, right? So Henry Highland Garnet actually becomes this on the antithesis to Frederick Douglass, because Frederick Douglass doesn't support Blacks leaving the US, but he does. So when looking at individuals such as Henry Highland Garnet, he kind of evolves away from the Absalom Jones, Richard Allens, and viewed that, Blacks, as long as slavery exists, as long as an institution, they'll have no safe place or safe haven. All right. So with that being said, that is the end. I think we lost a couple people, but are there any questions? Please feel free, or points you would like to make, or if there's something I may have gone too fast over, please let me know. I know I just wanted to make sure we didn't run out of time.
No,
Yes,
thank
ma'am.
you, Dr.
Oh,
Donaldson. And I think we do have a question from one of the members of the class. So go ahead on. I think that was Jeffrey trying to get in here.
Yes, sir. Real quick.
I was just going to.
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead, sir.
No, I was just trying to thank Dr. Donaldson for her time and a wonderful talk tone tonight. But go right on ahead.
I'm sorry. I didn't want to lose the thought. I think you referenced racial uplift. I know you did, Dr. Donaldson, earlier when you was talking about Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. And so you said that the goal was to lift up, or the free Black, free African society. The goal was to lift up all Black people. I guess my question would be, how do we promote racial uplift today in light of all that we have up against us today?
Okay. All right. So one of the ways you do racial uplift, right, is something as simple as what Andre did with inviting me here, in regards to speaking here with this this class, right? And the promotion. If you look at the life of the Right Reverend Andre Dr. Johnson, you see an individual who is a scholar activist out consistently fighting for the upliftment of the Black community, right? And there are many different ways you can do racial uplift. That is, some people tie racial uplift to like respectability politics or why does it have to be race, but in looking at the idea of advocating for and supporting, better schools for our kids, or the idea of supporting organizations that are going to be advocates for the entire community, you have several different models that would fall into the category of racial uplift. So a real simple, like I said, the one of the easiest ones I can think of right now will be looking at the life and ministry of the Right Reverend Dr. Andre Johnson. He is a complete advocate of racial uplift. Am I wrong, Dr. Johnson?
Well, I try to be out there, try to follow my call. I'm just trying to, if I can just get close enough to the scholarship that you're doing, I know I'll be all right, Dr. Donaldson. I just know I'll be all right. Let me go. I think De'Aaron has a question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Donaldson, for this this lecture. It was particularly edifying for me in my work. I'm thinking about a specific section of my perspectives. And so if you get an email from me in the coming days, don't be surprised. I was curious as I was listening to your lecture, the folks that were covered in the theology that was covered, if I'm not mistaken, was a bit northern centric.
So it starts out in the north, right? So okay. You do get, but what happens with the founding of the first AME Church in Bethel, they get representatives from different parts of the country, so that you eventually get, for example, what happened, the Denmark VC churches, down in South Carolina. So yes, it initially starts out in the Northeast, but there's certain things they're limited to do, right? So Nat Turner and the Black community in New Orleans and Charleston, South Carolina are able to have their own independent institutions that are able to have sermons and spaces that are separate from the gaze of whites, and that they could. So even something as simple as, or even individual, such as, like I said, Denmark VC's church in Charleston, that's, that freaked whites out to the point where they were like, well, we have to stop allowing them to have these, they can't have these gatherings without white supervision. But when it started, no, it was not like, it originated in Philadelphia because of what Philadelphia represented, because of the Free Aid Society. But it quickly spread, AME quickly spread throughout the country, in the North and the South. And eventually you'll get these spaces in cities like Charleston and New Orleans, where they're able to hold up Black churches that are able to be independent without white supervision. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, you answered my question. But you sparked up a follow-up question. I guess my question is: have you noticed any distinct difference, or differences, or maybe differences might not even be the word, nuances, in the way that folks in Philadelphia, for example, are thinking about their theology versus a New Orleans or a Charleston, specifically as we're thinking about resistance and the issue of slavery? And I'm gonna mute, because if I don't, then I'll ask you another follow-up question.
So to answer that question, there isn't that much of a distinct difference right now. And the reason why I say that is really simple. The fact is that these places eventually all end up being like hubs for those fleeing slavery, right? So in particular, somewhere, say like in Charleston or something like that, they would give people refuge until they could flee the city, right? So all of these churches, as long as they are independent and something that's not within the gaze of whites, they're going to adhere to the theology or the doctrine of the AME Church, which is they're anti-slavery. and they are going to be anti-slavery. And that's a key cornerstone of their identity, is that they are anti-slavery. And so they're going to support any kind of movement. And they will provide, like I said, so in a real easy way would be providing shelter for those seeking to flee. And so, you know, that difference with the North and the South doesn't really start to develop until you get the distinct, like you would say, for example, Bishop Charles Mason in the creation of the Pentecostal church in Memphis. That's very different. That starts out as something Southern, but no, the AME, not in the early, no, they're all adherent to, because their primary focus is ending slavery, freeing as many Blacks as possible.
Dr. Donaldson, we do have a couple of questions from Facebook and other social media outlets. Let me just get one in, something that's right up your wheelhouse, actually. What role did African-American women play in the war efforts, especially during the Civil War and then after the Civil War, going into, I would imagine that the person was thinking about Spanish-American War, perhaps, during the 19th century.
Sure. Sure, absolutely. So Black women, of course, are going to be important in regards to roles of being nurses. And in fact, you know, I go back to Harriet Tubman being the first woman to ever lead men in, first woman, period, ever in American history to lead men in battle. And she does that during the Civil War. She serves as a spy, as well as a military commander in helping to liberate over 700 slaves that are in South Carolina. But Black women, primarily during the war efforts in the Civil War, going into the Spanish-American, Cuban, Filipino conflict, they're going to serve as nurses. You do occasionally get, for example, Cathay, oh my God, I forgot her last name, but she disguised herself as a man to fight as a soldier. You get primarily the evidence is going to revolve around them being nurses. And Cathay Williams, thank you. They're going to be nurses and spies, I think, but primarily nurses, especially on when you have segregated hospitals. Right. So that's their key roles within that guard, with the exception of course, Harriet Tubman, who gets to lead men in battle. She's an exception. But in looking at Black women's roles, they are going to be important to the home front in regard when we think about sustaining the morale of soldiers, et cetera. So Black women are always going to be important to Black soldiers, especially as long when you have a segregated military, because they have to fill a lot of roles that are only for Black women, because white nurses aren't supposed to treat Black soldiers and all those type of things. So yeah, somehow relating to Black liberation.
Of course. And then what was the relationship between David Walker and Mariah Stewart, if there was one, if there was a relationship between them and their activism?
Well, it was mentee, mentor. Mariah Stewart was very much once they became friends, when she met David Walker, she became an avid follower of his ideology and pushing for and which is why she picks up the mantle when he dies, right? To come out and say, look, because David Walker, very much in David Walker's appeal, is criticizing people who are like, if you aren't risking your life for the entire liberation of all Black people, you're not doing enough. And so she very much was a avid follower of his ideology, and their relationship is that of mentor mentee. Very simple, nothing romantic.
But all right, no, all right. Let's see. I'm gonna, we got time for maybe one more question from the class, if that is another question or comment.
But I want, Yolanda, what I wanted to ask was, I keep hearing in being in seminary, how women are still not being recognized in certain denominations as clergy, any kind of capacity outside of being administrative and carrying on, basically helping fill the pews pretty much of the churches. Based on your research and what you've done, is there any woman this day and age that is still pushing forward in various denominations? And I believe AME is still one of them, and Pentecostal, where women aren't allowed in the pulpit. And like I said, some of what I just said, I misspoke maybe a little bit as far as AME, but I know Pentecostal for sure. Women aren't allowed still to preach, or are not recognized, even with obtaining the education and being ordained, allowed in pulpit or respected. So can you answer that? Is there anyone leading the forefront to make that happen today? There's so many other issues, but that still seems like that's an important one in order for us, I guess, to try to come together. Period.
So I would say,
yes,
I would to answer that question, I would look at the advocates of womanist theology, the former students of Cone, who not only that, but also the Black woman, I forgot her name, who is a major proponent of queer theology. They are pushing for, not just the inclusion of women ministers, Pamela Lightsey, but also pushing back against the doctrine of oppression revolving women. Now, I'm not that familiar with those who are still, advocating for women not preaching. I know I did see something recently. There was some preacher who said that women need to follow men, and that, I don't know, it was a man, so it wasn't a woman. But I think that the advocates of womanist theology have really made a name and carved out a place for themselves where, yes, there is still a lot. Like I met a preacher here recently who was telling me about the issue she had as the leader as a Black woman leading an interracial church. But I think that, I can't single out any one denomination. I think that is just something that is going to continue to be an issue until you have I hate to say it, but a more widespread appreciation of, say, womanist theology, or a more widespread appreciation of and looking at liberation theology within and really re-examining what it is to be a Christian. Because this is some of the reasons why you have a lot of pushback relating to, say, the Black church that didn't embrace the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Chances are those are the places that may or may not be a little conservative in relating to gender roles. And so that's the best way I can answer it. I'm sorry. I don't know. I hope I answered your question.
No, you're fine.
That's all right.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, listen, we are again so thankful and grateful for you.
Thank you.
Dr.
These are
Latrice
great questions.
Donaldson for coming in. Thank you. Thank you, Facebook questioners and all. We are now officially, class, we are going to take a small break. We will end our live stream here. I will just remind everybody that tomorrow we will start earlier. Tomorrow it is 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. So we're going to start at 5:30, the Reverend Dr. Earl Fisher will be here talking about Albert Clegg, James Cone, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, putting them all in conversation. It should be a great talk. Again, show some love to Dr. Latrice Donaldson. Get her book, and shout out the book again, Latrice, Duty
Beyond the Battlefield. Hold on, wait. I got it right here. Duty Beyond the
So, yeah,
Battlefield.
there you go.
African
we got
American
that.
Soldiers Fight for Racial Uplift,
We-
Citizenship, and Manhood. It is at SI. You can get it Amazon, Barnes and Noble, SIU Press, anywhere, thrift book, anywhere you buy a book, you can order this book, and it would, it's awesome. But thank you all. These are great questions. I love talking about James Cone, and I love this class, so I appreciate.
Thank you. You really put us. You really frame the context in which we were talking about earlier tonight when Cone was saying that during his seminary experience, he never ran across any Black writers or knew anything of this rich Black experience that you just kind of shared with us. So when Cone begins to dig in that, it helps him develop this theology. So you came at a real good time to put all of that in context for us. Again, thank you very, very much. Catch her on the History Channel, the Buffalo Soldier documentary. She is one of the academic consultants. She is all on camera doing her thing. Just dropping intellectual knowledge and bombs all over the place. So if you have not watched it yet, please watch the History Channel. You can go online and you can catch that as well too. And you got a C-SPAN event coming up that we will keep everybody abreast on as well too. One of her lectures and talks will be presented live on C-SPAN coming up later this summer. So we are excited again to have you. Thank you, Dr. Latrice Donaldson, Assistant Professor of History, Texas A&M Corpus Christi. And class, we'll take a break and we will be back in about, let's do a 5-minute break so we can come right on back. And all of you on social media, I want to see you tomorrow, 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time for the Reverend Dr. Earl Fisher's talk on Albert Clegg and Black theology. See you then.